Gobekli Tepe is engineered water infrastructure that is 12,000 years old. I'm Curtis Holland, and I'm an independent historian who studies ancient history, ancient texts, and ancient symbolism through a scientific and first principles lens. And today, I'm going to walk you through Gobekli Tepe, the engineering at the site, the water system, the processing infrastructure, and the ecology carved into the architecture itself. So for those of you who don't know, Gobekli Tepe is an archaeological site in southwestern Turkey. It sits about 20 kilometers outside of the city of Sanliurfa, formerly Urfa in antiquity. While the site itself was discovered in the 1960s, serious archaeological effort didn't begin until Klaus Schmidt took over the project in the 1990s. You see, at the time, Gobekli Tepe was a paradigm shift. We had assumed that humanity had only started building large stone structures about 5,000 years ago. However, radiocarbon dates of tools found at the site and stratigraphy evidence of how deep the site was buried date the site at approximately 11,500 years ago. That's 7,000 years older than Stonehenge and 6,000 years older than the pyramids. Now, I say the site was discovered in the 1960s. It was actually buried underneath a hill, and it wasn't until it was dug out and truly excavated in the 1990s that we learned what the scope and scale of this finding was. And while these pillars have captured the imagination of scholars and tourists alike, there's much more to this site than these artistic forms. The site itself sits on top of a hill, with the closest major water source being the Euphrates River, approximately 60 to 80 kilometers away. At that location, there is no natural water source outside of the periodic rainfall, which means that the water supply issue had to be solved before this site was ever inhabited. So before any construction, before any food processing, before any labor can reliably begin, you need to solve the water problem. Well, it just so happens that when you look at the site, you see exactly that. When you look at these pictures here, you can see that the site contains massive rock-cut basins, carved directly into the hilltop bedrock. Then there are channels cut into the limestone. And in connecting these basins, it forms a gravity-fed distribution system. The current excavation team has documented corbelled ceiling cisterns, which function as underground storage tanks with arched stone roofs. Additionally, soil analysis from the site shows hydrophilic species plants that only grow on or near standing water. The site itself is located in an area that is semi-arid today, but 11,500 years ago, the rain would have been more prevalent, occasionally even forming drainage canals and marshes at the foot of the hill. The people who were building this site engineered a system to capture, store, and distribute the water across the region effectively. And this would allow them to stay there for an indefinite period of time and perform any actions, religious, hunting, gathering, or otherwise. And this demonstrates a functional mastery of the terrain and ecology, with a focus towards habitable sustainability. Which then brings us to another finding that's only grown the more that archaeologists have looked into it. More than 10,000 grinding stones, which are primarily used to grind grains or cereal, have been found at or near the site. That is the largest grinding stone assemblage of any archaeological site in the entire Near East. The volume of artifacts found demonstrates a long-term habitation pattern, as processed grains could be used for cooking, hunting, eating, and potentially early planting. This was around the time where the first farming technology seems to appear in the historical record. Going back to the engineered infrastructure, further excavation and chemical testing has revealed that these canal floors were lined with a substance called terrazzo. Now, terrazzo is a limestone-based composite material. It's typically used to line the floors and walls of various buildings and structures to prevent water damage. In fact, it's still a common process today. To make it, you have to burn limestone into quicklime and then mix it into a paste that you apply over a surface. When the composite cures, it's smooth, it's flat, it's waterproof, and chemically resistant. Now, terrazzo is not unique to Gobekli Tepe alone. In fact, we find it at many archaeological sites local to that area. But the point still stands. It's clear that the people who built Gobekli Tepe were using terrazzo in a functional way, and it was a repeated use of the same technology. So let's take all this into consideration. What we have here is a hilltop site with engineered water infrastructure and 10,000 grinding stones located right nearby. You have sealed floors, organized in a canal pattern, with functional corbelled cisterns, as evidenced by the chemical properties of decayed ceramics. As I previously mentioned, the site was originally excavated by a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt. This site was his baby. It was his major project. It was what he dedicated his life to. And he worked at this site for nearly 20 years before eventually passing away in 2014. Now, his belief at the time of discovery was that this was the world's first megalithic religious site. That hypothesis stood for much of the last 30 years. That Gobekli Tepe was a monumental religious site for the pre-pottery Neolithic period. Schmidt had the belief that symbolic architecture occurred before organized city planning. He used to say first the temple, then the city. In Schmidt's view, religion drove construction, not the other way around. Now, I know it's a running joke to claim that most archaeologists, when they can't explain what they see at a site, immediately jump to a temple. But in Klaus's case, it actually makes a lot of sense. At the site, you see massive carved pillars, animal reliefs, and then the absence of any real obvious residential structures in the early layers of stratigraphy. And the fact that the site was seemingly filled in, buried, and then abandoned around 8000 BC led Schmidt to believe that the site was closed in some form of ritual decommissioning. He also published works on the symbology of the site, connecting the site to death rituals and rites performed on the deceased. Now, the interesting thing is there were rituals performed at Gobekli Tepe, or at least the hill it sits on, by the local Kurdish population for thousands of years. They maintained a religious continuity with that location, despite being unaware of the site buried beneath their feet. But like any science, the conclusions and theories are ever-changing. After Schmidt's death in 2014, the academic interpretation shifted. Dr. Clare took over the site and reframed Gobekli Tepe not as a religious site, but one of settlement, with some religious elements in it. His team began to identify various domestic features and lithic assemblages, suggesting that people lived at the site instead of just visiting periodically for religious purposes. But now let's take a closer look at both of these interpretations and see how they stack up to the evidence. Schmidt's temple model primarily focuses on the massive stone pillars, but it doesn't really have a good explanation for the 10,000 grinding stones or the apparent water infrastructure located at the site. And while Clare's assessment does account for those, in framing this as a habitated long-term settlement, he still struggles with the scale of the operation, as well as the smooth-lined terrazzo floors in the canal infrastructure. Now, I do want to note that the water infrastructure is published and it is known, but, and this is important, it's not what any of the major interpretations ever focus on. Instead, most interpretations focus on the massive stone T-pillars, what they were, who built them, and why. So now let's take a closer look at these pillars. You see, the carvings on the pillars can be read and interpreted several different ways. Schmidt saw religious symbolism, spirit animals, supernatural beings, and the like. Other researchers like Martin Sweatman have proposed astronomical encodings, the pillars having stellar alignments. The current research team led by Clare reads them as social identity markers. But regardless of how you slice it, each interpretation treats the animals as stand-ins for abstract ideas. A fox represents cleverness, a vulture represents death, and a scorpion represents a constellation. But each of these theories treats the carving as symbolic, not practical. Another researcher has a different idea. Now, I apologize, I'm about to butcher the hell out of this name. Dragos Gheorghiu, a professor at the National University in Bucharest, published 2 peer-reviewed papers with a different interpretation of what the pillars were. He argues that the animals are habitat indicators. Each carving describes a local environment. And here's the thing that gives that credence. Every animal on a pillar at Gobekli Tepe is an animal that can be found local to the site in southwestern Turkey. Schmidt, along with another researcher, Joris Peters, confirmed this in 2004. The osteological, that's bones, record at the site contains bones from the same species carved on the pillars. Gazelle and wild donkey appear together on pillar 21. Those are dry steppe species. Aurochs, which are bulls, wild boar, and cranes appear together on pillar 38, and those are near to wetland species. And across the site, each combination describes a specific type of landscape local to the area. However, on pillar 53, there is some interpretive disagreement. Peters and Schmidt, when they surveyed the site, identified these elongated creatures as snakes. And that's a fair assumption. If you want to associate this site with religious myth, Most religions in history have snake symbolism somewhere deep in their substrate, but Gheorghiu argues that they're fish, specifically catfish. The ones with the large triangular heads match a species called Celaris triostegus, which are catfish native to the Euphrates and Tigris river systems. And catfish bones are confirmed at the site. On each pillar where these animals appear, they're shown in dense groups. This is definitely a clue, as snakes don't group together like that or school in unison. Fish do, especially during the spring spawning, the time when their activity would have been the greatest. Additionally, these carvings with the elongated and slender bodies match spiny eels, also native to southeastern Anatolia. These 8-shaped objects on this pillar match fish traps, a net fixed between two poles. And to add more to that assessment, some researchers have concluded that these rippled features on the stone pillars here are actually meant to symbolize water. And if we're to stay with this idea that these pillars map to aquatic sites, then there's another conclusion that is followed from that data. Every aquatic animal shown in enclosure D is necrophagic, meaning that they're a scavenger. They're either bottom feeders or they feed on dead insects or animals. On pillar 20, a catfish is positioned next to a bovid lying on its side, which is presumed to be dead. And then on pillar 43, one of the major famous pillars, a crayfish faces a large cat, and that cat is also lying on its side. These necrophagic fish species show up during and after river floods, and these dead mammals are consistent with drowned carcasses that occur in the aftermath. So what does any of this actually mean? If we are to apply first principles here and make the assumption that humans are thinking practically, not just symbolically, think about what that demonstrates. What you see here is an understanding of the local ecosystem. When I say that Gobekli Tepe is engineered water infrastructure, what I'm saying is simply this. Water infrastructure isn't a feature of the site. It is the organizing principle of the site. The basins, the channels, the cisterns, they were planned and built first. Everything else, the pillars, the grinding stones, the carved animals, all of it sits on top of and operates around a hydraulic system that was engineered before anything else could be constructed. That makes Gobekli Tepe an integrated site, not just a religious location and not just a village, but a complex, planned, and engineered settlement organized around water capture, water storage, food processing, and ecological documentation. And that's just our best read of the surface level after 11,000 years of burial. Why this matters is that it is 6,000 years before we see the closest functional analog for this level of technology. The Mesopotamian canal systems, the Egyptian Nile irrigation, or the Nabatean rock-cut cisterns are the closest demonstrable parallel. Those are functionally similar structures, and up until the excavation of Gobekli Tepe, we believed that to be the origin of that level of technological sophistication. Clearly, it wasn't. Now here's the part where I want you to think. For 30 years, the standard framing of this site was built around the assumption that the people who made it could not have been doing what the evidence shows that they were doing. Pre-pottery Neolithic foragers were not supposed to be able to construct engineered infrastructure on the top of hills. They weren't supposed to be able to process grains at scale. They weren't supposed to be able to burn limestone into quicklime to create functioning sealed floors. So when the site showed up doing all three of those things simultaneously, the response wasn't, we need to update our hypothesis on what these people were capable of. The response was, this must be a temple. And then when the temple model started showing cracks, the response became, okay, well, this must be a village. And both of these framings are downstream from the same starting assumption, that the cognitive ceiling for these people is somewhere below what the evidence actually says it is. And what gets me the most, perhaps the most implicit assumption, their cognitive ability was somewhere below ours. In the last few years, you've seen the consensus quietly drift toward more integration, more sophistication, more planning. But without anyone in the field acknowledging that framing they held onto for 30 years was fundamentally wrong about what these people could do. And that's a pattern you see repeatedly in archaeology and in science in general. It doesn't make anybody a villain. It just demonstrates how institutions correct themselves, often retroactively, slowly, and without ever admitting fault. But that's why first principles matters. If you're trying to figure out what the site actually is, you want to read the evidence, not the framing of the evidence. Because when you read the evidence, what you get is this. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were thinking, they were planning, they were problem solving. They identified a hilltop with no surface water and engineered hydraulic infrastructure to make that location habitable. They built grain processing infrastructure capable of feeding a sustained population. They sealed the working surfaces with lime-based composite, and they carved the ecology of their environment, including the seasonal flood cycle, into the structural architecture of the site itself. That's not primitive. That's not hunter-gatherers stumbling into something they didn't understand. That's modern human cognition, working with modern human planning and execution capacity. The only difference is that they were operating in a constrained world. But the brain was there, the math was there, the systems thinking was there, 11,500 years ago. So that then begs the question, if this site was a paradigm shift demonstrating that the functional capacity deep into antiquity is vastly exceeding what we currently know, how far back does that level of cognitive ability truly go? And that, my friends, is a question for another time. I'm Curtis Holland, and I'll see you on the next one.